Paul Joseph Watson with Infowars.com, and I'm speaking with John Scobie of We Are Change Birmingham, who was one of the participants in a BBC documentary that aired last night in the UK called 7/7 Conspiracy Road Trip, which, as we predicted months ago on this channel, would be a complete hit piece, which is exactly what it was. So we're going to lift the lid on what really went on behind the scenes with this BBC documentary. John, welcome to the show.
Thanks very much for having me, Paul.
So just describe quickly the premise of the show and the participants who are actually involved with it.
Okay, so I was approached by Renegade Productions, which is a production company that creates programmes for the BBC, in about May of this year. And they had informed me that they were trying to get contributors, 4 or 5 contributors for this 7/7 road trip. They punted it to me, or put it across to me, that it would be some type of investigation into the events of that day. They'd already previously done a 9/11 one the year before, which I'd seen, and could tell it wasn't really what I would call a documentary. It was more a reality show, and that's exactly what this show was. They weren't interested actually in any facts whatsoever. It was mainly to repeat and cover the government's narrative, which we are told is the truth, and of course we are not allowed to see evidence from the courts or from the police to show us that many of these the questions that are raised is the truth. And in fact, I now, sitting here after seeing it aired last night, consider the programme not just to be a piece of propaganda, but actually a piece of indoctrination, just to reinforce the information that the BBC and obviously the government have been putting out with 7/7.
And so the people involved, we had you, we had a Muslim girl, we had a guy who basically comes from a UFO field of research, and he thinks aliens control his thoughts. Nothing personal, but that's what he said in an interview with me. I'm sure he's a nice guy. Then they had some model who at the start of the programme was presented as this truth-seeking activist, but by the middle of the show we learned that she's basically just proofread some articles for a magazine, doesn't know her arse from her elbow, to put it bluntly, and by the end she's attacking the other participants. So just go into briefly who else was in the show apart from you, and why you think they chose them to be in the show.
So as you described, we had Tony. I really did enjoy the week, and I had a good time with everybody. And I think I should say that is that, this isn't a personal attack or a personal vendetta against anybody. Tony, as you said, he's a UFOologist, but actually he was picked for his CCTV background. But I found when he was in the show, he was actually very emotional, and I think part of the problem there was that he hadn't, like the other 2 contestants, he hadn't watched the 9/11 show, so was not really aware or prepared for how they were going to question and edit and cut the pieces up. Davina was an absolutely lovely girl. She was a newly converted Muslim. She'd converted to Islam after 7/7, so obviously she had a specific view that she didn't actually think that Muslims had done it. But again, it wasn't coming from a very factual position as I tried to come from. It was more just of a point of view of, well, I don't think that Muslims, in inverted commas, are evil people and carry out these types of atrocities. I mean, obviously you will find evil people in all walks of life, in all races, religions, creeds, colours. And then we have Layla, who, many of my friends, as I was watching the programme last night, said she's a ringer, she's a spy. And I've got to say, I do not think that Layla is a spy. Again, I think that, as you just mentioned, Paul, she's done some proofreading of some articles. She's found them interesting. But then when she's actually gone onto the show and actually had to follow the storyline, she can't determine the difference between the narrative and other things that we know to have happened on that day, the emissions and the red flags, I suppose, that show to many of us that something else went on that day.
And the reason why, apart from yourself and probably the Muslim girl, but they were really scraping the barrel because a lot of people refused to partake in this show because of the very fact that in the previous shows that the BBC had done, notably the 9/11 road trip last year, it was set up as a smear, as a hit piece, and people knew that. And even though they promised to you beforehand that it wouldn't be, turned out, as we predicted, that it was. So that's why they found it difficult to get people who were really at the top of the research field in terms of false flag or 9/11/7/7, because there's plenty of them out there. And in fact, most of them were asked to be in the show. I was asked, other people were asked. They all said no because they knew what it was. So they ended up with, you know, a couple of people who they basically played off against each other to characterize conspiracy theorists as just either whack jobs or insensitive or ignorant of the facts. So let's just go through what they left out of the show and how they characterized yourself and these other participants as conspiracy theorists, how they ran the smear piece. Go through it.
Yeah, so from literally the word go of the programme, Andrew Maxwell, who's an Irish comedian, was narrating, and one of the first things that the camera flips to me, and they've got a little cut-in segment of me saying it's to continue the wars in the Middle East. Just that segment. Now Maxwell then goes on to say that's nonsense, and I don't believe that. I think that's nonsense. He then goes on to say it was an extraordinary journey to change the minds of these individuals. So it wasn't, as they tried to point out, an investigation into the facts. The road trip was to change our mind and to actually look at us as individuals, as a group, as conspiracists or conspiracy theorists, which they kept banding the term around. And as you and I both know, Paul, the term conspiracy theorist is two words added together. It's a conspiracy, which is a few people doing something, evil or coming together to create some type of organisation or doing something wrong. Pretty much, it doesn't have to be. You could conspire to do something positive. And of course, a theory. We all know what a theory is. That is something which people would like to think is real or is potentially not real. So they band these two words together, conspiracy theory and conspiracist, and literally every point in the programme, when they had an opportunity to call us either conspiracy theorist or conspiracist, they did that. So I would say that it wasn't an investigation into the truth. It was an attack, a reality show to attack people who have views which don't agree with the government. And as you know these days, Paul, it's dangerous not to agree with the government. And I think that in terms of the BBC's previous Conspiracy Files programme and the 9/11 road trip last year, as you know, we know they don't focus on the facts, and I should have been more prepared for them to totally edit and cut out all of the facts.
I think what we're seeing is, and you're right, the term conspiracy theorist is a pejorative. It's laden with negative connotations just by saying it, so that's why they use it over and over again. But I think they've changed their tactics kind of, because the old BBC conspiracy shows from 5-6 years ago were about the BBC going out and trying to attack the conspiracy theories. Now they're doing it through so-called conspiracy theorists because nobody trusts the BBC to do it directly. So in getting people to recant their ideas, the viewer, sees it and thinks, oh, they really believed in this, now they don't. That must mean it's not true. And that's the process that we saw with the programme. So just go through some of the things that they edited out. They left in a lot of stuff which was kind of nebulous, built a straw man case, blew up a bus at the end and said, look, that proves everything, as if anyone ever argued that you can't blow up a bus. So just tell us about some of the things that you said during the show that were edited out, which you told me obviously were the most powerful things that you said, which were left out.
Okay, so on day one, when we were up in Leeds, first of all, I will say that they changed the narration of the show and actually would cut elements, cut 2 minutes from here or 30 seconds from there, put them together, and in the show it made it look like it was all part of the same conversation, which I didn't think was very genuine. I didn't think that there was any need for that. If you're doing a documentary, you're doing a documentary. You don't need to edit it to look like something else. The potential things that I said, we could have made, I was working out earlier, there should have been about 35 hours worth of footage, at least, because we were on the road for 5.5 days, Monday through till Saturday lunchtime, and there must have been at least 5 or 6 hours worth of filming every day. Obviously the show's only an hour long, so a lot of it's going to reach the cutting room floor. They did put a load of us, footage of us eating and footage of us on the bus having a row, which they had previously promised wouldn't go into the programme. So that was quite interesting to see them totally just break that promise straight away. And it obviously showed to me that it was about the reality show aspect to it, as opposed to the investigation into the truth or searching for the truth. What I would say that, were my main points that I was trying to hammer home to every person that we spoke to, including Maxwell. He's not a daft person. He starts off the show by saying, we know that the police, have locked up people, who weren't guilty, IRA, whoever it may be, particularly in the 70s and 80s. So he said, I understand the distrust for the government. What I said, which I thought was important, was around Operation Gladio, which of course was a NATO stay-behind army after the Second World War, which was, we now know it has been declassified through the ex-Italian Prime Minister, etc., that they blew up buses, trains, were involved with blowing up schools and things like that. And so this is historical fact, this is historical record, this is not conspiracy theory, and there is huge amounts of documentation to back this all up. And I said to the researchers, the cameramen, the director, this is really important. The only reason I'm going on the show is because I know you're going to edit it and it's not going to be great, but I just want 1 or 2 of these little bits of substance to please get in there so that the British people can have a choice in terms of the information that they see on this subject. And I thought the amount of times that I talked about Gladio, Al-Qaeda being funded by the CIA, being given $6 billion in 1989 through to 1992, the fact that Al-Qaeda was shipped in or flown in to fight proxy wars in Bosnia in the early 90s. I thought that some of this has got to get in there. And as I was watching it last night, I realised none of this is getting in there, John. I also spoke about Operation Northwards, which I thought was important. I had when they came to me and first asked me to take part, they said, what are your 2 most important, issues that stand out for you, 477? And I spoke to yourself and I spoke to a number of other researchers, and they said, well, what you want to do is pick a subject, pick a point which they cannot disprove you on. So that's what I pretty much did. I took the fact that the CCTV footage after King's Cross, there is none of it. And obviously in the most surveilled city in the world, that's mighty strange. And I also took the issue with Peter Power and his training exercise, Visor Consultants. And then I also tied that all into, there was the Panorama, which was around about 12, 14 months before, Terror on the Tube, which Peter Power took part in. And they forgot to mention that bit, strangely, when I was discussing it with them. I also tried to put forth the understanding that I have about 9/11, which was that Mayor Giuliani was running a drill that day or that weekend, which envisaged World Trade Center 7 being evacuated, Tripod 2. So I spoke about all these facts on numerous occasions with numerous individuals. And it appears that they just all disappeared, and none of these issues were important, according to the director, obviously.
And also, I mean, throughout the show, this kind of rhetoric was pushed. Do you really believe they could do this to their own people? And the answer is, yes, they can, and history proves it, because we had MI5 agents providing the bombs within the actual bomb squads of the real IRA that ran the plot at Omar, which killed 28 people, killed 9 children, and it was the MI5 agent giving them the bomb to carry it out. And then we had, the headlines in the Sunday Herald. The army asked me to make bombs for the IRA, told me I had the Prime Minister's blessing, then tried to kill me. They've done this before. They've infiltrated terrorist groups, given them the bombs, carried out the bombings that killed, dozens of people. So the claim, how can you even consider they do this to their own people? They have done it. They've killed 1 million friggin' Iraqis based on fabricated nonsense. So, yeah, they're going to kill...
And thousands of our troops.
Yeah, so 52 people in London, what does that mean to them when they've killed 1 million Iraqis? I mean, it's just the mindset that they'd never do this is completely naive, because they had done it. False flags throughout history have started wars that have killed tens of thousands of people. Going back, though, they also had this thing running throughout the show, which was hijacking the genuine, heartfelt grief of the victims and using it to bolster the official story, as if it was your fault, because you're questioning the official story, that they're going through the grief. So they tie the grief to the official story and then make it look as if you're attacking it. Wasn't that the case?
Yeah, I mean, I was very, very careful with what I said to anybody who had either been there that day, had lost loved ones, or whatever, because I understand that this is probably one of the most painful things that could happen to somebody in their life. Maybe either surviving the blast or losing a loved one, a family member to it. So I wasn't there sort of trying to rile those people up and putting what I believe to them. I just asked them questions such as, would you support a public inquiry? And of course, everybody that I spoke to and asked that question to said that they did want either a public or independent inquiry, because there was only an inquest into the bombing.
It was the government that stonewalled the proper investigation. It wasn't the conspiracy theorists, was it? It was the government.
Yeah, Tony Blair. He promised that there would be a public and independent inquiry. And of course, the Inquiries Act, which came out, which was passed into power only a month before 7/7, exactly a month before, actually, a Canadian Judge Corey, Peter Corey, I believe it was, said that this would make any inquiry totally impossible, because it means that the executive, i.e. the Prime Minister or the head of that department, has all of the power in terms of what information is brought out within that inquiry. So, we're unlikely to see a real inquiry into 7/7. And an inquest is actually supposed to be, a thing that is used when only one person is killed. Now, obviously, we had the 56 people, it was the 52 plus the 4 bombers, and they decided to do an inquest. Well, that would usually mean that there should be a public inquiry. So, in terms of what the government did, what they've done to now, the information that we've had released, it's totally not in line with what they should have done and with what other researchers have found out under freedom of information, and just the distortions within the reports itself. They have had various reports into the accounts and reports, they call them. They're not official or independent inquiries, they're accounts or reports. So in other words, somebody's written a story, and that is what the BBC and the media has been telling us for the last 7 years. Other things which I found strange in the story, and in the filming of the programme itself, was the fact that we'd have these discussions, and quite in-depth discussions, and we would actually be onto facts. And then when I watched the programme last night, all of that was edited out. There was none of that. It was literally the first 1 minute discussion, X, Y, and Z, give the expert his time. Obviously, I'm not an expert, so they're immediately, made to look better than the rest of us.
And you challenged some of these experts, but they included absolutely none of that.
I challenged all of them. They didn't show us any of that. I challenged all of them on Gladio. I thought this was a really important piece of information. There was the terrorism lawyer that had been involved with actually trying, although they've never actually been prosecuted, with pretty much finding the 4 men guilty. That wasn't shown in the programme. When I asked him about Gladio, he'd never heard of it. He's been a terrorism lawyer for 15, 20 years. I would have hoped that he would have heard about Gladio at least. I then put this question to a gentleman called Crispin Black, who is a terrorism expert on behalf of the media and the government. And when I pushed him on Gladio, he said, "Oh, yes, I know about that, but it's nothing to do with that." But every other person that I did speak to about Gladio had never heard of it. So obviously they didn't want to show that footage, because that would show me looking like I'm quite informed and quite a smart, articulate, reasonable person. As it was, they just got me saying not outlandish comments, but just sort of one-line statements and comments where obviously they could rebut it afterwards and edit around it.
And even though your time was probably the least amongst the four, they spent most of the time on the two, I would say, least informed and most easy to discredit people. So you could see from the very start that's where they were going. Other issues, they couldn't address the surveillance issue where none of the bombers are seen in the actual subways where the bombings took place after a certain time.
How could they?
Yeah, because all the CCTV footage miraculously failed. That wasn't explained. Other issues, Benjamin Netanyahu, who was in London that very morning, got a warning not to go to his conference, which was taking place in a hotel situated directly above one of the stations that got bombed. The London police also got that warning because they telegraphed it to the Israeli embassy. So that prior knowledge and specific prior knowledge of where the bombing would specifically happen, because Netanyahu stayed in his hotel room, that wasn't covered at all. And then we had this, it was mainly straw man, wasn't it? Because we had the bus at the end and it was like, look, we can blow up a bus. That must prove the official story. And not yourself, but a couple of the other participants were like, yeah, that proves it for me, that's fine. Proves what? Proves that you can blow up a bus. I mean, just explain the bus thing and the difference between the actual 7/7 event and this explosives expert that they got to blow up the bus.
So this gentleman that we met in a quarry in the south of England was, an expert, and I would say he was about 70 years old. He said he'd been blowing stuff up since the age of 15. He was an expert. He worked with Top Gear and other BBC programmes and I think he was just been on the Kevin McLeod programme as well. And he's a genius. He knows how to make bombs. Now these guys were they were aged between the age of 20 and 30. I'm not saying that you can't find out this information. Of course you can. But they tried to portray the fact that they blew up the bus as you were saying, evidence that these men must have done it. Well, that's just total lunacy. I mean, if you have a hypothesis, you have to prove that hypothesis. There's no correlation between somebody being able to make a homemade explosives out of, I'll give you the ingredients because they said that they weren't going to show us anything to do with the ingredients and all this, but, I don't see what the harm is. He used 80% military grade, I think he described it as, peroxide. We then went to a Boots or a pharmacist to see if we could buy peroxide, and the maximum you can buy peroxide percentage volume-wise is about 7%, and that's still powerful enough to dye your hair blonde. Now, you can buy as much of it as you want, so that's where they argue, well, the photographs of the bomb factory show little heaters under which they were cooking these, they were reducing the liquid off the peroxide, and they were making it more concentrate to put into these bombs. Now, they didn't show much of this guy, but he was a really interesting chap and actually talked to me about Dr. David Kelly's murder and said how he had his own questions about that. And I had my 9/11 Investigate 9/11 hoodie on, and he said, well, I don't know about that, but I wouldn't be surprised at all because I know that the government, particularly the American government, has been involved in so much stuff over the years, etc. He was a well-educated guy. He knew what I was getting at, I think. So first of all, he uses totally different ingredients to what apparently the bombers had bought. He also then said that these backpack bombs, first of all, the backpack bombs that we see on the back of the bombers, they're huge, big bags. They're full, what I call camping bags, sort of 100, 200 litre bags. The bomb that he made was just in a biscuit tin. It was only a very, very small kind of space volume of the material that he used, and you saw the damage that it did. It blew the top off the bus. The other issues surrounding that are that he said you wouldn't want to be in that car for long driving down from Leeds and then getting on the train from Luton because these things could have gone off. Although he used a fuse to set it off, he said that these bombs potentially could have gone off. And then there was the question of why would they leave 2 or 3 other bombs in the car? Surely if you've taken a load of bombs, you're going to take them all to blow them up. Various issues were raised on the back of the bombing, on the back of the bus bombing. And I thought it was very disingenuous what they did. They just turned to me, John, does this prove anything to you? I know I can't prove everything to you. And I just said, look, you proved that a professional...
Prove you can blow up a bus, well done.
I mean, And then he kind of had a go at me. I noticed he had a go. Oh, we're getting somewhere with John, but he's only sort of saying things that are proven facts. Yes, because that's what's important, Andrew. We don't just jump the gun and say, well, we blow up a bus, therefore it was 4 Muslim men. It's not logical.
It would be like somebody being in court for arson, and the evidence that they did it would be them going out and setting fire to a building and saying, look, that's proof you did it. How is it related to it in any way? Yeah, you can blow up a bus. We know that. But just in summary, I mean, they got the people involved. 2 of them at least were basically put in there to be discredited, so that could be used to smear everybody else who's asking questions. They ignored some of the major issues. They built a straw man with some of the others. Any other issues in summary?
I think that I would say that the director, although the crew were all lovely, the director was trying to prompt us quite often, and actually Layla, who was the girl that totally changed her mind, she actually was prompted quite often by the director in terms of, well, say this, say that. Now, when Davina was prompted and she asked her, will you say this? You stand at the front of the bus and you say your bit, this is my part of my conspiracy, which I didn't like any of that at all because I was trying to stick to my points that I'd gone in there with. Davina refused. She said, no, I'm not going to say that because that's not one of my points that I stuck to. I was a little bit more willing and said, I will say that yes, online people have said that it wasn't a bus bomb that blew it up. But that was because of, I believe, a French investigator had a look at the wreckage and said it was military-grade explosive. He'd found some residue which led him to believe it was military-grade explosive. So that's why I was willing to say that. So the other things that I would find kind of annoying about it was the director trying to lead us into statements. And obviously, if it's a factual documentary about the facts, then that shouldn't be happening. The other interesting bits which I think are important just to note is that Peter Power, who was running the drill, I'm going to keep harping on about this ball because it is important. He said that day on his when he was talking about his exercises that the bombs were simultaneous. Now, of course, it wasn't until the Saturday lunchtime that the police came out and said, oh, actually, the bombs were simultaneous. Up until that point, they'd thought that they'd gone off anywhere between 8:50 and 9:30. Now, we understand that the bombs were simultaneous at 8:50, the 3 train bombs, the underground bombs anyway, and we took part in this journey from Luton on the train. They said that we'd all reached our stations in time. I didn't reach my station. Me and the researcher got on the wrong tube. So they were immediately lying within their own programme. There was another thing which they said, which, again, a lie about me. They said that I took them to Birmingham. Now, as most people would probably know in a television programme, you don't choose where you're going. You get taken there. Now, they obviously wanted to take me to Birmingham to talk to Dr. Nassim, who is a guy that I know, who's an outspoken Muslim on terrorism and doesn't believe it himself. And they stitched me up and said John took us to Birmingham, and then filmed it and edited it and made it look like I had taken them to Birmingham. So that was very, very clever, very disingenuous, very sneaky. So there were 2 points there which I'm not happy with. I may even speak to Ofcom about it because why not get a rebuttal or an apology?
So you're saying with the actual train times, which was portrayed that everybody made it on time and it would have been perfectly feasible, that you didn't in fact make it on time?
I didn't, no.
So they were completely just lying?
Yeah, we didn't make it on time because we got on the wrong tube. Now, potentially we could have got there, but we didn't. And they said in the programme that we did. So, yes, they're lying. It is a lie. He also, I noticed, at one point said, John believes that the train times were falsified by the government. This wasn't one of my main issues, but they got, like I was saying, they kind of put the words in my mouth and said, well, don't you know about the train times though, don't you, John? Why don't you tell everybody about the train times? And all I said was, initially, the government said that they got the 7:40. Of course, the 7:40 didn't run that day. After Freedom of Information Act request through the July 7th Truth campaign, etc., the government had to backpedal and said, well, they must have got the 7:25 because anything after the 7:40, they wouldn't have actually got into London on time. So they said that they got the train before, the 7:25. They're noted going into the station at 7:22. There are massive omissions within the CCTV footage, wrong times, wrong dates, and the Home Office just expects us to say, oh, well, you know, there are cock-ups when it comes to CCTV footage, which I would have thought was one of the major critical aspects to a CCTV camera, is to have the right time, right date, to have film in it, for it to be working. Again, you know, surely heads should have rolled in terms of jobs should be lost if, you know, these things weren't fulfilled. So very, very strange still. As I mentioned, we met this Crispin Black chap who was a terrorism expert. I put to him about he was in the army, I think he was in the SAS actually. I put to him that that we didn't know, or did he know about Gladio? He said yes, and of course it's nothing to do with Gladio. I spoke to him sort of at length regarding whether he considered there to be a chance or an element within the government to carry out these types of things, and he said yes, it is a possibility. He also went on to say, this Crispin Black chap, that terrorism would probably have come from, you know, the Muslim bombers, but he wasn't totally sure on it. Now, for somebody who's a terrorism expert, it was very wishy-washy, and I found that a lot of the experts were very wishy-washy.
But they were all depicted as being dead on message, weren't they?
Yeah,
in the actual documentary.
Secret evidence.
Now, just mention the thing about, because there were 5 editors above the production team that made the final cut. That's what they told you beforehand, wasn't it?
Yeah, so one of the camera guys said to me when I first joined the programme, one of the researchers said, don't expect it not to be biased. So I knew what I was letting myself in for straight away. And then the camera person actually said, well, usually, really nice crew, everybody really enjoyed the time with them. Said, actually, John, yeah, usually you'd expect 5 levels of director producers on this kind of show. Now, what is shown in the credits is just one director producer. So whether or not there was, or, you know, I don't know. But certainly, obviously, the programme has had 3 months to be edited. It's been edited, whittled down from 35 hours worth of footage. Obviously, me ranting quite a lot about facts which I wanted to get into the public domain. And all of it has been taken out. And a really interesting point that the terrorism expert Crispin Black was actually not shown in the programme was because me and Andrew Maxwell, high-fived after his interview. We were actually really excited. Maxwell actually comes off as quite anti-establishment if you speak to him in real life. For whatever reason, he doesn't come across like that in the show. But we high-fived because we pretty much pushed, or we didn't push the guy, but Crispin Black said, for Blair's, Jack Straw's, and Alistair Campbell's dealings within the Iraq War, down to the Downing Street memos, he said, I'd give them a spade and get them to dig their own grave. He said they need to be held up for treason. He was saying that they should be killed. Now, that didn't get in there, and we thought that was the most powerful part of the programme. So, you know, what's going on, Paul? They are literally cutting out all the meat of the programme, anything that came across good, and simplifying it, lying, and then obviously when it gets into the editing suite, totally distorting it and...
Turned it into a reality show instead of an investigation.
Anything else that I'd have to say probably would be going on the difference between an inquest and an inquiry. Obviously they didn't do an inquiry, and people need to look into that, why there was not a real inquiry, and why did they carry out an inquest as opposed to an inquiry? Because, of course, under an inquest, not all of the facts need to be made relevant or made public. And also, why was Peter Power not questioned by the police? I mean, that's a massive, massive issue. And, you know, and to finish off, I was discussing earlier with a friend the fact that Demos, which of course is this think tank that I've heard you discuss so many times before, bought out their Power of Unreason documents, which pretty much links conspiracy theory to extremism and to terrorism, and says that actually it snowballs conspiracy theorists snowball and become extremists and become terrorists in real terms. And I think that is the point of the programme. It wasn't so much propaganda, it was indoctrination to make the public think and feel like this. Yet, although I saw on Facebook and on Twitter and all the social medias, it didn't really have the response that I don't think they wanted to. Many people were just saying, we don't believe this stuff anymore. And, I thank anybody for their positive comments towards me or all their support.
And if you read the comments in the newspaper articles, the online versions before the documentary, most of the people in those were also saying we don't believe any of this. So that's why, as I said, the BBC are no longer trusted to debunk a 9/11 or a 7/7 on their own. They're discredited. So they have to get people, conspiracy theorists, to recant and then point at them and say, look, even they don't believe it anymore. That's the whole process. Because their previous 7/7 documentary, there was actually an academic study carried out comparing it to 7/7 Ripple Effect, which is one of the most prominent 7/7, truther documentaries. And that academic study, independent study, found that 7/7 Ripple Effect, the sequence of events in that documentary was more likely to have been the truth compared to the BBC snow job hit piece. So academically, independently, the BBC has been proven to be biased, proven to manipulate, and that's what we saw in this so-called documentary. They've got two more coming out in this series. One's on creationism and the other one is UFOs. So now they're taking 7/7, trying to throw it in with these fringe topics.
Totally. And, to be fair to Maxwell, obviously he's just the host. I don't think he really understands probably what he's involved in even. But he just said, oh, look, it's all a load of nonsense. And as I mentioned to you previously, one evening when I had him over a pint of Guinness, I said, look, Andrew, you've got this drill being run this day by Peter Power, these visor consultant people, and they've backtracked about what was going on that day. I said, then you've got loads of drills going on 9/11. And I said, and you've also got drills being run by the ATF on the morning of that incident, on the morning of that bombing. I said, can you not see any, pattern emerging here? And he said, yes, John, I see what you're saying. I need to do some research into this. And of course, by the morning, he didn't want to know again. But hopefully, people that watch the programme, it may make them go away, have a look online, do a bit of research. I really hope that that's what happens, because that's what I wanted to go on there to do. But they just edited and cut so much meat out of the subject that I feel that that's kind of impossible, because they actually didn't portray even the government narrative pretty well, let alone what we consider to be the truth, or more likely to be the truth of the events of that day. So it's very demoralising. They're very disingenuous. I'm not pointing the finger at anyone individually, although I think the director obviously has a lot to answer for. But whether or not the buck stops with her, as we discussed previously, we do not know. There could be, varying levels of execs that it has to go for before it gets on TV. At the time of the bus bombing, just to caveat with this, at the time that when we blew up the bus, they said, oh, this is going to be really, we were not going to be able to get this on the TV, and they were sort of saying, oh, the BBC, they're going to have a nightmare over this. Yet when we discussed with Crispin Black the fact that Tony Blair should be had up for war crimes, and Alistair Campbell and Jack Straw, well, there was no mention of that. We thought that was great. That was going straight in the programme. Although they said that the bus and the bus bombings probably wasn't going to go in there. Now, of course, the bus bombing was going to go in there, because that was the bit of promo, or the bit of interesting visual that they needed to fill it. And I think, with all due respect to the other contestants, that's probably why they had Layla involved as well, because they wanted a pretty girl to attract a few male watchers. As we know with the media, that's what happens all the time. The whole thing, mate, from beginning to end, retrospectively, was a piece of indoctrination into why and how conspiracy theorists and conspiracists are nuts, or don't know what the hell they're talking about, or just to believe the government and these are the facts of the day, and don't worry about these other fringe people, because they've got it a bit wrong. They don't really know what's going on. And, I challenge anybody to discuss the facts with me. I mean, as you know, I did a lot of research before I went in there, which is why I think I was able to stick to my key points and not have my sort of mind change, so to speak, because I knew what the critical elements of it were. And although the harrowing emotional discussions with the people who lost family members and who had survived and had been there that day, was totally harrowing, and I totally feel, I don't feel their pain. I mean, it's far greater than I'm sure than I will ever be able to feel. But the reason that I'm doing this, Paul, is because I think that it is important, particularly if the government is involved with doing all this, that we get this information out there, and it isn't to be insulting, and it isn't to be, to insult the memory of those 56 people that died that day, or, as we discussed, the millions of Iraqis since. It's to get the truth out and to try and dig a little bit deeper, and also just allow, what happened to freedom of speech in this country, where we were allowed to actually say what we thought without being attacked and being called pretty much a terrorist for discussing an issue, which is potent and, very volatile.
And just for people outside of the UK who wonder why we get so worked up about the BBC, basically, if you've got a television in this country and you don't pay your yearly licence fee directly to the BBC, you get men in suits who knock on your door and ask you questions and demand you to pay this tax, which is what it is. And a lot of people are calling for that to be abolished, but it's onerous. That's why people don't like the BBC, and they've been exposed again and again for agenda-driven, smear, snow job, hit piece documentaries going back years, since 9/11, basically. So we're going to leave it there. John Scobie, We Are Change Birmingham. We'll be sure to talk to you again, and thanks for joining us at Infowars.com.
Thanks very much, Paul.
Thank you.